There is a skull on a spike outside Westminster Hall in London. It has been there, on and off, for over 20 years. The head of a man who was already dead when they put it there. Who had been dead for 2 years, in fact, when they dug him up, dressed his rotting corpse in burial clothes, dragged it to the gallows, hanged it, and then cut off his head and displayed it as a warning to anyone who might ever again consider doing what he had done. What had he done? He had killed a king. Not in battle. Not in secret. In public. With a court, a trial, a verdict, and an axe, on a cold January morning in front of thousands of watching people. His name was Oliver Cromwell. And in the entire history of Britain, there is no figure more argued about, more hated, more reluctantly admired, and more impossible to reduce to a simple verdict. He was a farmer who became a general. A Puritan who became a king in everything but name. A man who fought for Parliament's freedom and then dismissed Parliament at sword point. A man who executed a king in the name of liberty and then ruled as a near dictator for the rest of his life. He is the most extraordinary contradiction in British history. And the story of how he rose, ruled, and fell apart tells you something profound about power, about ideology, and about what happens when a man is absolutely certain that God is on his side. To understand Cromwell, you need to understand the world he was born into. England in the early 17th century was a kingdom at war with itself in slow motion. Not yet with guns and armies, but with ideas, grievances, and a gathering fury that had been building for decades. The Stuart kings, James I and then his son Charles I, believed in the divine right of kings. The idea that God had placed them on the throne and that their authority was, therefore, beyond question or challenge. Parliament, which controlled taxation and represented the landed gentry and merchants of England, disagreed. It believed that the king governed with Parliament's consent, not above it. Charles I was a particularly stubborn man about this. He dissolved Parliament 3 times when it refused to give him what he wanted. He tried to rule without Parliament entirely for 11 years, a period known as the personal rule or, by its critics, the 11 years' tyranny. He raised money through increasingly dubious means, including a revived medieval tax called ship money that was supposed to be for naval defense but was clearly being used to fund the crown's general expenses. He also antagonized the fiercely Protestant majority of England by pursuing religious policies that looked suspiciously Catholic to many, led by an Archbishop of Canterbury named William Laud who was deeply unpopular and eventually executed. When Charles tried to impose a new prayer book on Presbyterian Scotland in 1637, the Scots rose in revolt. Without money to raise an army, Charles had no choice but to recall Parliament. Parliament came back furious. And among the new members was a relatively obscure gentleman farmer from Huntingdon named Oliver Cromwell, 50 years old, previously unremarkable, who would, within a decade, become the most powerful man in England. What made Cromwell extraordinary was not his politics, at least not initially. It was war. When the civil war between king and parliament finally broke out in 1642, the parliamentary forces discovered very quickly that they had a problem. Their army was not very good. Aristocratic officers with no real military competence commanded men who had no real motivation to fight. The royalist cavalry, led by the king's nephew Prince Rupert, repeatedly shredded parliamentary forces on the battlefield. Cromwell saw this with clear eyes. He wrote to a cousin early in the war with words that have become famous in British military history. He said that Parliament needed men of spirit, and that a plain russet-coated captain who knew what he fought for and loved what he knew would be worth more than that which you call a gentleman but who is otherwise nothing. He built his cavalry, later called the Ironsides, on exactly that principle. Not aristocratic birth. Merit. Discipline. Motivation. His cavalry were men who actually believed in what they were fighting for, who prayed before battle, who maintained discipline after victory instead of dissolving into looting as cavalrymen almost universally did in this era. The Ironists were devastating. At the Battle of Marston Moor in 1644, Cromwell's cavalry broke the royalist forces decisively. At Naseby in 1645, the new model army, a reformed parliamentary force built largely on the model Cromwell had developed, effectively ended the war. The king fled, eventually surrendered to the Scots, and was handed back to Parliament. Most people expected a negotiated settlement. Charles would accept limits on his power, agree to Parliament's terms, and remain king under a constitutional arrangement. Charles refused. He negotiated in bad faith, secretly encouraging foreign intervention, plotting with the Scots to reinvade England, refusing every settlement offered. A second civil war broke out in 1648. Parliamentary forces won again. And now Cromwell, who had initially been willing to negotiate with the king, was done. He later wrote that Charles Stuart, the man of blood, had renewed the war that had already killed tens of thousands of English people, and that there must be an accounting. What followed was one of the most shocking events in European political history. In December 1648, the army staged what is called Pride's Purge, physically removing from Parliament those members who still wanted to negotiate with the king. What remained, the Rump Parliament, put Charles I on trial for treason against his own people. The legal logic was breathtaking in its audacity. The king was being tried by his own subjects for the crime of war against them. Charles refused to recognize the court's legitimacy. He was right that no precedent existed for it. He said repeatedly that no earthly power had authority over a king appointed by God. The court convicted him anyway. On January 30, 1649, Charles I stepped out of a window of the banqueting house in Whitehall onto a scaffold. He was dignified, composed, spoke briefly to the crowd. Then he laid his neck on the block, and with a single blow, became the first English monarch to be publicly executed by his own government. The crowd, by most accounts, let out a collective groan. Not of celebration, of shock, of something that had never happened before happening, and the terrible weight of that reality landing all at once. England was now a republic, called the Commonwealth. No king, Parliament in charge, and Cromwell, the most powerful military figure in the country, theoretically just one member of the governing council. It did not stay that way. The next years consumed him in constant war. Ireland, where a royalist and Catholic uprising had produced massacres of Protestant settlers, required a brutal campaign of reconquest. Cromwell's campaigns in Ireland, particularly the sieges of Drogheda and Wexford, where he ordered the massacre of garrisons that had refused to surrender, produced a death toll and a scorched earth destruction of the country whose memory is still bitterly alive in Ireland today, for centuries later. His name remains a curse in Irish folk memory in a way that almost no other English figure does. Scotland, which had crowned the executed king's son as Charles II, also had to be defeated. Cromwell won. He was an extraordinary general, arguably one of the finest England ever produced. But he was less successful at governing in peace than he was at winning in war. Parliament kept frustrating him. The Rump Parliament, the remnant that had voted for the king's execution, turned out to be fractious, self-interested, and slow to pursue the godly reformation of society that Cromwell believed God had placed him in power to achieve. In April 1653, in one of history's great ironies, the man who had fought for Parliament's rights walked into the chamber with a squad of soldiers, told the MPs they had sat too long for any good they had been doing, and expelled them at gunpoint. Parliament dismissed. By the man who had gone to war over Parliament's right to exist. What followed was a series of increasingly desperate constitutional experiments. A nominated assembly of godly men, called the Barebones Parliament by its critics, after one of its members whose actual name was Praise God Barebone. It also failed. In December 1653, Cromwell became Lord Protector, a new title for what was, in practice, a military dictatorship. He ruled by dividing the country into 11 military districts, each governed by a major general, one of his trusted officers. The major generals enforced a strict Puritan moral code. Theaters were closed. Bear-baiting was banned. Christmas celebrations were suppressed. Alehouses were regulated. People found guilty of adultery faced severe punishment. These years are remembered in England with a particular kind of grim resentment. The joyless years. Whether Cromwell genuinely wanted to impose this culture on England, or whether circumstances and his religious convictions drove him there, historians still debate. What is clear is that the English people grew deeply tired of it. In 1657, Parliament offered Cromwell the one thing that might have stabilized his rule: the crown. They literally offered to make him King Oliver. He agonized over it for weeks. His advisers were divided. His religious convictions made him deeply uncomfortable with kingship, the institution he had helped destroy. But his practical political instincts told him that a monarchy, with its ancient legitimacy and understood constitutional position, would settle the endless uncertainty about the country's future. He refused. He could not bring himself to take the title. It may have been his most consequential decision. By refusing the crown while holding all the power of a king, he left England's constitutional position permanently unresolved. And he left no clear successor who commanded the loyalty of the army. In September 1658, Oliver Cromwell died of a fever, probably related to malaria he had contracted years earlier. His son Richard took over as Lord Protector. Richard Cromwell lasted 8 months. Without his father's military reputation or political genius, he could not control the army officers, who could not agree among themselves on anything. In the chaos that followed, with the country desperate for stability, General George Monk marched his army from Scotland, engineered a restoration of the full Parliament, and Parliament invited Charles II, the executed king's son, back from exile. In May 1660, Charles II entered London to enormous crowds and celebrations. The monarchy was restored. The Republic experiment was over. 2 years later, they dug up Cromwell's body, hanged it, and put his head on a spike. It stayed there for 24 years. So who was Oliver Cromwell? The question has never been settled. In England, he is still genuinely divisive in a way that few historical figures remain after 4 centuries. In Ireland, he is simply a monster. In some Protestant traditions, he was a champion of religious liberty. To English Republicans, he was a traitor to his own cause. Perhaps all of these are true at once. He was a man who genuinely believed he was doing God's will. This is both the explanation for his greatness and the source of his worst acts. A man certain of divine sanction has no check on his behavior other than his own conscience. And consciences, even sincere ones, have a remarkable capacity to accommodate whatever the man who holds them most desperately wants to do. He fought for Parliament and dismissed it. He fought against tyranny and became a tyrant. He refused to be king and ruled as one. He built a republic and left it so fragile it collapsed within 2 years of his death. And yet, England after Cromwell was never quite the same. The idea that a king could be tried and executed, that sovereignty rested with the people rather than with the crown, that military and parliamentary power could trump divine right, these ideas did not die with the Restoration. They went underground, gathered strength, and emerged again, transformed, in the glorious revolution of 1688 that permanently established constitutional monarchy in Britain, and whose reverberations eventually reached a set of colonies in North America where men were arguing about taxation without representation. The skull on the spike was meant to be a warning. It turned out to be something else. Proof that it had happened. That a king had been tried and executed by his own people. That the old order had been broken once and could be broken again. You cannot unring a bell. History is not behind us. It is us.